Look what the cat dragged in. We need a tracker, not a high school cross-country runner looking for a participation trophy. Is this some kind of joke? The voice of Deputy Miller, thick with the self-satisfaction of a man who mistakes volume for authority, cut through the tense air of the mobile command post. The small crowd of exhausted deputies and volunteers, huddled under the dripping awning against a persistent Oregon drizzle, offered a few nervous chuckles. They were tired, they were scared, and Miller was in charge, so they laughed. She stood before them, a figure of profound anticlimax. Sergeant Evelyn Cross had been 5 miles into a morning run along the Clackamas River when her radio, a small, ruggedized unit clipped to her waistband, had crackled to life with the urgent summons. She hadn't gone back to change. She wore simple black running shorts, a gray moisture-wicking shirt dark with rain and sweat, and trail shoes caked in the rich, dark mud of the riverbank. She was small, wiry, with her brown hair pulled back in a severe, functional ponytail. There was nothing about her that suggested a solution. There was nothing that demanded respect. She looked, as Miller had so loudly observed, like a lost jogger. But when Sheriff Thompson, a man whose face was a roadmap of long nights and hard-won wisdom, saw the way she stood, not at attention, but with a perfect, rooted stillness, her weight balanced, her eyes scanning not the faces before her, but the terrain behind them, he felt a flicker of something ancient and familiar, a profound and unnerving competence. If you believe that true strength doesn't need to announce itself, type quiet professional below. The insult, delivered for public consumption, simply dissipated in the damp air around her. It found no purchase, no reaction. Sergeant Cross didn't flinch, her expression didn't change, her breathing didn't even hitch. Her gaze remained distant for a moment longer, cataloging the slant of the rain, the direction of the wind, the subtle currents in the churning river. She was absorbing the problem, inhaling the environment, while Miller was polluting it with his ego. Finally, her eyes settled on the deputy. They were calm, clear, and utterly unreadable. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "Sergeant Cross," she stated. It wasn't an introduction. It was a simple declaration of fact delivered with the same emotional weight as a weather report. Miller scoffed, a wet, dismissive sound. "Sergeant of what? The local running club? We've got a 6-year-old boy, Leo, missing for 5 hours. The dogs have lost the scent right at the river bend. The thermal from the chopper is useless with this cloud cover, and every minute we waste is a minute this kid gets colder. I need a real asset, not a volunteer with good cardio." He jabbed a thumb at a large, laminated map pinned to a corkboard, a chaotic scribble of red circles and blue search grids. "This is a professional operation." The irony of the word hung thick and heavy in the air. Cross's eyes moved to the map, and for the first time, a flicker of something registered. It wasn't offense. It was analysis. Her gaze traced the lines, the topography, the established perimeters. It was the look of a master cartographer examining a child's crayon drawing. She took a single step forward, her movements economical and silent, and pointed a steady, mud-flecked finger at a small, unmarked area on the map. A dense patch of old-growth timber and tangled ravines designated Zone 7. "Immediate assistance requested in Zone 7, she said, her voice a low monotone that carried with surprising clarity. It was a direct quote of the radio summons, a subtle reminder that she hadn't wandered in. She had been called. Miller's face flushed with anger at the implied challenge to his authority. He was about to unleash another volley of sarcasm when Sheriff Thompson placed a heavy hand on his shoulder. "Let her work, Deputy," Thompson said, his voice quiet but lined with steel. The order brooked no argument. Miller fell silent, his jaw tight, his resentment a palpable force. Cross, seemingly oblivious to the drama she had caused, turned away from the command post and began to walk toward the trailhead that led into the deepening gloom of Zone 7. She moved with a rhythmic, ground-eating stride that was neither a run nor a walk, a gait of relentless efficiency. The crowd parted before her, their nervous laughter replaced by a confused, watchful silence. They were witnessing something they didn't understand. It was the silence of assumption, the quiet before a paradigm shift. They saw a jogger. Thompson, however, saw the ghost of a memory, a young airman he'd met years ago at a joint training exercise, someone who moved with that same eerie quiet, that same unsettling calm in the heart of chaos. He saw a professional. The failure of the initial search was a symphony of frustration, each instrument playing its part in a chorus of despair. The bloodhounds, two of the best in the state, had followed the boy's trail with frantic purpose from the picnic area where he'd last been seen, their bays echoing through the forest. But they had stopped dead at a muddy confluence of a creek and the main river, whining in confusion, the scent obliterated by the rising water and the ceaseless rain. The helicopter, a state-of-the-art bird with $1 million thermal imaging suite, could only see a uniform, cold gray, the dense canopy of the Douglas firs acting as an impenetrable shield, hiding the forest floor in a blanket of thermal noise. The grid search teams, composed of well-meaning but exhausted volunteers and a handful of local deputies, were moving too loudly, too quickly, their boots churning the forest floor into a muddy soup, destroying the very signs they were looking for. They were searching with their eyes, but they were not seeing. They were calling the boy's name, their shouts swallowed by the thick, sound-dampening woods and the roar of the river, their voices likely driving the terrified child deeper into hiding. Every conventional method had been exhausted. Every tool had failed. Hope, the most essential piece of equipment, was beginning to run low, replaced by the cold dread of a recovery operation. This was the wall of impossibility that Sergeant Evelyn Cross now faced. She stood at the edge of the creek where the dogs had lost the trail, the point of failure. But she saw it not as an end, but as a beginning. It was a data point. The scent was gone. A fact. The boy was near water. A fact. The search was loud and chaotic. A fact. From these simple truths, she began her work. She didn't pull out a GPS or a compass. Instead, she closed her eyes. For a full minute, she stood perfectly still, letting the rain wash over her face, becoming a part of the landscape. She wasn't looking. She was listening. Listening to the rhythm of the forest, the cadence of the river, the subtle shifts in the wind. She was filtering out the noise of the search, the distant shouts, the crackle of radios, and tuning into something more fundamental. She was trying to hear the silence where a 6-year-old boy should be. Deputy Miller watched from the command post on a live feed from a body camera worn by a junior deputy assigned to follow her, his arms crossed, a smirk of vindication playing on his lips. See? What's she doing? Meditating? We need action, not yoga. But Sheriff Thompson leaned closer to the monitor, his expression intense. He saw not indecision, but immense concentration. It was the calm of a surgeon before the first cut, the stillness of a bomb technician over a live wire. Cross opened her eyes. They seemed darker, more focused. She knelt, her knees sinking into the cold mud, and gently touched the water. She let the current flow over her fingers, feeling its temperature, its speed. Then she began to move, but not along the established paths. She moved parallel to the creek, her steps so light they barely registered on the soft earth. Her head was on a constant, slow swivel, her eyes not scanning the horizon, but the ground, the space between things. She was reading a language no one else there could comprehend, the language of disturbed soil, of bent twigs, of displaced stones. The junior deputy following her struggled to keep up, his heavy boots sucking at the mud, his breathing loud and labored in the body cam's microphone. In contrast, Cross flowed through the undergrowth, a wraith in gray and black, her passage marked only by the quiet rustle of ferns springing back into place behind her. She was a whisper in a shouting forest. The silence from her was not an absence of sound. It was a tool, a weapon against the chaos. It was the manifestation of a discipline forged in environments far more hostile than a rainy Oregon forest. It was the quiet that precedes a moment of profound and undeniable truth. The air in the command post was thick with the smell of wet wool and stale coffee, a tangible miasma of fading hope. On the main monitor, The body cam feed from the deputy tailing Sergeant Cross was a shaky, disorienting view of ferns and mud. Deputy Miller paced back and forth, his boots thudding on the temporary flooring, a loud metronome counting down the minutes. "This is a waste of time and resources," he announced to anyone who would listen, which was everyone. "We should be pulling back, regrouping, waiting for the weather to break. Following this jogger on a nature hike is getting us nowhere. We're losing the light." He gestured at the darkening sky, his frustration boiling over into theatrical anger. He was performing his authority, trying to wrestle back control of a situation that had slipped from his grasp the moment Cross had walked into the woods. He needed her to fail, not just to be proven right, but to restore the comfortable, predictable order of his world, where rank and volume equal competence. His assumptions were the foundation of his identity, and she was a walking, silent earthquake beneath them. Suddenly, on the monitor, Cross stopped. The shaky camera view stabilized as the deputy behind her halted. She stood before a massive, fallen log, slick with moss and decay, a natural wall in the dense woods. Any logical path led around it. The previous search teams had all gone around it. But Cross was not following logic. She was following instinct honed by 1,000 similar moments, 1,000 other lost souls. She didn't go around. She placed her hands on the log, her fingers finding purchase in the rough bark, and vaulted over it with the fluid grace of a gymnast. The deputy following her swore under his breath and began the clumsy, noisy process of scrambling over, the camera lurching wildly. On the other side, Cross was already kneeling. The camera finally focused on what she had found. There, nestled in a small depression at the base of a log, almost completely swallowed by the mud and decaying leaves, was a small, plastic toy soldier. It was green, its rifle broken, but it was unmistakably the one the boy's crying mother had described him clutching when he vanished. A collective gasp went through the command post. The air crackled with sudden, static electricity. Miller froze mid-pace, his mouth half open. "No way," he whispered, the sound barely audible. That's half a mile from where the dogs lost the scent. It's on the wrong side of the creek. It was impossible. It defied the scent cones, the probability matrices, the entire established methodology of their search. But the proof was right there in high-definition video. Cross didn't celebrate. She didn't even look back at the camera. She held the toy soldier in her palm for a moment, her expression unreadable, then carefully placed it in a clear evidence bag from a small pouch on her belt. She then pointed towards a dark, ominous opening a few yards away, the mouth of an old, concrete drainage culvert, mostly obscured by a thick curtain of overgrown blackberry vines. It wasn't a place anyone would think to look. It was dark, wet, and forbidding. But to a small, terrified child seeking shelter from the noise, the rain, and the scary, shouting adults, it was a perfect hiding place. A fortress. Without a word, she moved towards it, pulling a small, powerful flashlight from her belt. The beam cut a sharp, white cone into the oppressive darkness of the culvert. The deputy's voice, shaky with adrenaline and awe, crackled over the radio, patched through to the command post speakers. "Command, this is Deputy Allen. The tracker, she's found something. I think we've found him." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a vacuum, sucking all the air, all the sound, all the doubt out of the room. It was the deafening silence of a miracle. Miller stood rooted to the spot, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. His arrogance, so loud and impenetrable just moments before, had been shattered into a million pieces by the discovery of a single, broken toy. The jogger had done the impossible, and she had done it without saying a word. The command post, once a hub of frantic noise and directionless energy, was now paralyzed in a state of suspended animation. Every eye was locked on the main monitor, where the beam of Sergeant Cross's flashlight probed the darkness of the culvert. The deputy's breathing was the only sound, harsh and ragged over the speakers. Then another sound joined it, a faint, whimpering cry from the depths of the concrete pipe. It was the sound of salvation. A wave of raw, unfiltered emotion washed through the room. Deputies clapped each other on the back. Volunteers wiped tears from their eyes. The radio operator choked out a confirmation to dispatch. But amidst the celebration, Sheriff Thompson moved with quiet, deliberate purpose. He walked past the stunned Deputy Miller, who looked as if he'd been struck by lightning, and sat down at the central communications console. His movements were calm, but they carried an immense weight, the authority of a man about to restore order not just to a search, but to a moral universe that had been knocked off its axis. He tapped a few keys on the ruggedized laptop connected to the console, his large, weathered fingers moving with surprising speed. He bypassed the local network, accessing a secure federal database through a dedicated link. A simple search box appeared on the screen. He typed, "Cross, Evelyn." A single file appeared. He clicked it open. The screen filled with lines of black and white text, a sterile, bureaucratic summary of a life lived at the sharpest edge of human experience. For a moment, Thompson just read, his expression unreadable but for a slow, grim nod of profound respect. He had suspected, but the reality was more than he had imagined. He picked up the main broadcast microphone, his thumb depressing the transmit button. The click silenced the remaining chatter in the room instantly. His voice, when it came, was not loud, but it filled the space completely. It was the voice of command, of history, of finality. "All units, listen up," he began, his tone leaving no room for interpretation. "The individual who has located the missing child in Zone 7 is Sergeant Evelyn Cross." He paused, letting the name and rank sink in. He then looked directly at Miller, whose face had gone pale, a dawning horror spreading in his eyes as he began to understand the magnitude of his error. Thompson's gaze was like a physical weight pinning the deputy in place. "For the education of those present," the sheriff continued, his voice laced with ice, "let me provide some context." He turned his eyes back to the screen, reading from the file in a clear, measured cadence. Each word landed like a hammer blow, systematically dismantling the foundation of arrogant ignorance that Miller had built. "Unit, United States Air Force Pararescue. 24th Special Tactics Squadron." A murmur went through the room. The 24th STS was the stuff of legend, the Tier 1 Special Operations Unit that went where no one else could, the proverbial tip of the spear. They weren't just soldiers, they were myths. Call sign, Wraith. The name fit so perfectly it was chilling. A silent ghost who moved through the shadows to bring people back from the dead. Deployments, 14. Afghanistan, Iraq, Horn of Africa, and multiple other locations which remain classified. The scope of her experience was staggering, a lifetime of service compressed into a single line. Specialty qualifications, master certificates in high-angle rescue, combat search and rescue, austere medicine, and personnel recovery. She is also the lead instructor for the USAF Combat Survival School's Advanced Tracking and Evasion course. Thompson looked up from the screen again, his eyes sweeping over the assembled deputies and volunteers. "The course," he said, letting the words hang in the air for a moment, "that uses the field manual she wrote. The same manual, Deputy Miller, that is currently sitting in the back of your patrol car." The silence in the room was now one of profound collective shame. The jogger, the Girl Scout, the amateur. She was not just a professional. She was the professional. The one who wrote the book. The standard by which all others were measured. Sheriff Thompson placed the microphone carefully back in its cradle, the plastic click echoing in the cavernous silence. He stood up, his tall frame seeming to fill the entire command post. His eyes, however, never left Deputy Miller. The deputy, for his part, looked smaller, diminished, as if the sheriff's words had physically compressed him. The swagger was gone, replaced by a waxen, sickly pallor. His authority, built on a flimsy scaffolding of bluster and sarcasm, had collapsed into dust. Thompson walked over until he was standing directly in front of his subordinate. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The quiet authority he radiated was more potent than any shout. "Deputy," he said, his voice low and gravelly, a quiet rumble of thunder. "That woman, Sergeant Cross, is on post-deployment leave. She was trying to find a little peace running by a river after her last tour, a tour where she pulled 3 wounded SEALs off a mountainside under active enemy fire. When the call for volunteers went out, she answered. She didn't have to. She wasn't on duty. She did it because it's who she is. It's what she does. She runs toward the sound of trouble. He leaned in slightly, forcing Miller to meet his gaze. You, on the other hand, you stood here in the warmth behind a map, and you used your rank to publicly humiliate a volunteer based on what? Her size? Her gender? The fact she wasn't wearing a uniform you recognized? Thompson shook his head slowly, a gesture of profound disappointment. You didn't see a professional. You saw what your prejudice wanted you to see. And in doing so, you almost cost a little boy his life. Your assumptions, deputy, are a liability this department cannot afford. This wasn't just a reprimand. It was a public vivisection of a man's character. It was a lesson delivered with surgical precision for the benefit of every single person under that awning. The message was clear. Competence is the only uniform that matters. Respect is not given by a badge. It is earned by action. While Thompson was delivering his verdict, the radio crackled to life again. It was the junior deputy's voice, but the tremor was gone, replaced by a tone of pure reverence. Commander, Sergeant Cross has the boy. He's cold and scared, but he's okay. He's okay. She's got him wrapped in her thermal blanket. We're coming out now. A moment later, the body cam feed, which had been pointed at the ground, lifted. The image was shaky but clear. Sergeant Cross was walking out of the woods, carrying the small boy in her arms. He was wrapped cocoon-like in a silver emergency blanket she had produced from her small pack. His face was buried in her shoulder, his small hands clutching the back of her gray running shirt. Cross herself looked unchanged. Her face was calm, her stride still steady and efficient despite the added weight. She was just a woman carrying a child out of the woods. But now, everyone saw her for what she truly was. She was not a jogger. She was a guardian, a rescuer, a quiet, unassuming hero who had walked out of the rain and into their lives, held a mirror up to their own inadequacies, and then simply, professionally, done the job. As she approached the tree line, Sheriff Thompson stepped out from under the awning into the rain. He didn't say a word. As Sergeant Cross drew level with him, he stopped and rendered a slow, perfect salute. It was a gesture of immense, profound respect, an acknowledgement from one old warrior to another. It was the only validation she would ever need. The story of that day on the Clackamas River spread not like wildfire, but like the slow, inexorable rise of a tide, seeping into every corner of the state's first responder community. It began as hushed conversations in the locker rooms of the county sheriff's office, then jumped to hushed tones over dispatch radios during the quiet hours of the graveyard shift. It became a topic of discussion in training briefings for search and rescue teams from the coast to the high desert. It was told and retold, each telling adding a thin new layer of myth and legend. They didn't call her Sergeant Cross. To the hundreds of deputies, firefighters, and paramedics who only heard the story, she was known by a single, evocative name, the Wraith of Zone 7. The tale became a parable, a cautionary lesson about the mortal sin of assumption. Rookies were told the story by their training officers as a way to hammer home the core principle of their profession. Look past the surface. A person's worth is not in their uniform, their title, or the volume of their voice. It is in their actions, in their competence under pressure. The legend served as a powerful corrective, a cultural antibody against the kind of lazy prejudice exhibited by Deputy Miller. The narrative always centered on the contrast. The loud, arrogant deputy with his maps and his bluster, and the quiet, unassuming runner with her silence and her impossible skill. The broken toy soldier became a sacred relic. Sheriff Thompson had it mounted in a small, elegant shadow box, right next to the official departmental commendation awarded to Sergeant Evelyn Cross, in absentia, as she had quietly departed the day after the rescue, her leave over. The box was hung in the main lobby of a sheriff's office, a permanent, silent testament to the day's events. Below it, a small brass plaque read, Leo's Soldier, found by Sergeant E. Cross, USAFPJ. Never judge competence by its cover. Visitors would often ask about it, and the deputies on duty would tell the story with a reverence usually reserved for fallen heroes. They would describe the rain, the failing search, the impossible find, and the moment the sheriff saluted the quiet woman in running shorts. The story became part of the department's identity. The culvert where Leo was found, once an anonymous piece of forgotten infrastructure, was now known informally by every first responder in the county as Cross's Point. It was a landmark on their mental maps, a place that signified both a great success and a profound lesson learned. It was a reminder that the most critical terrain to navigate is often the landscape of one's own biases. The most profound transformation, however, was in Deputy Miller. The public humiliation he endured could have broken him, made him bitter and resentful. Instead, it remade him. For weeks, he was quiet, withdrawn, performing his duties with a grim, joyless efficiency. The swagger was gone, the sarcasm silenced. He had been forced to look into the mirrors Sergeant Cross had held up, and he had been disgusted by what he saw. One day, he accessed the department's training budget and, with the sheriff's quiet approval, enrolled himself in a series of advanced courses: land navigation, wilderness survival, and a tracking seminar for law enforcement. He spent his own money to attend a SAR conference where he sat in the back, taking meticulous notes. He was, for the first time in his career, trying to become the professional he had always pretended to be. He was replacing the hollow shell of his arrogance with the solid foundation of actual skill. He was learning, in the hardest way possible, the difference between talking the talk and walking the walk. He was learning the value of silence. The true ripple effect of Sergeant Cross's actions was not in the stories told, but in the actions inspired. Her quiet professionalism had recalibrated an entire culture. The change was subtle but significant. Deputies began listening more and talking less during briefings. Volunteers were treated with a new level of respect, their local knowledge valued over procedural dogma. The focus shifted from the performance of authority to the execution of the mission. The lesson of that day became institutionalized. Deputy Miller, in his quiet quest for redemption, became its most unlikely and powerful evangelist. He never spoke of his own humiliation, but he became a fierce advocate for humility in others. When a new, overconfident rookie would dismiss a suggestion from an old-timer, Miller would be the one to step in, his voice low but firm. "Listen to him," he'd say. "Experience doesn't always wear a uniform." He never mentioned her name, but everyone knew who he was talking about. He was paying his debt, not to her, but to the standards she embodied. Sergeant Cross herself remained a ghost. She never returned to the area, never answered the letters of thanks from the department or from Leo's family. The commendation was mailed to a P.O. box at an Air Force base, and the department received a simple, typed note in return: "Just doing my job. Thank you." SGT. E. Cross. Her humility was as profound and unwavering as her skill. She didn't need the accolades or the praise. The successful rescue was the only reward she required. For her, the outcome was the only thing that mattered. The vindication was irrelevant. This, perhaps, was the most powerful part of her legend. She hadn't acted to prove a point or to put an arrogant deputy in his place. She had acted to save a child. Her silence in the face of insult wasn't a tactic. It was a reflection of her focus. The noise of ego was a distraction from a mission, and she was a woman who was pathologically focused on the mission. A year after the rescue, a young woman joined the county's volunteer SAR unit. She was quiet, small, and unassuming. During her initial training evaluation, she consistently outperformed the other, more physically imposing recruits. She read the terrain with a natural, intuitive skill. One of the older deputies, watching her work, remarked to his partner, "She reminds me of someone." Later, Deputy Miller approached the young woman as she was cleaning her gear. He didn't offer praise or platitudes. He simply handed her a well-worn, dog-eared book. It was a field manual on tracking and survival. "Read this," he said gruffly. "It was written by the best there is." The young woman looked at the cover. The author's name was listed as E.M. Cross. She looked up at Miller, a question in her eyes. He just nodded. Study it. The answers are all in there. Not just how to track, but how to be. He then walked away, leaving her with the legacy of the woman she would never meet, a legacy of quiet competence passed down, not in a grand ceremony, but in a simple, humble exchange. The torch had been passed, ensuring the silent, professional standard of the Wraith would endure. A full 2 years passed. The rain-soaked day at the Clackamas River had solidified into institutional folklore, a foundational story told to every new recruit who joined the sheriff's department or the volunteer SAR team. It was no longer just a story about a specific rescue. It had become a teaching tool, a Socratic dialogue on the nature of competence itself. Sheriff Thompson stood before a new class of fresh-faced SAR volunteers in a brightly lit classroom. The shadow box with Leo's broken soldier hung on the wall behind him, a silent observer. The recruits were eager, nervous, a mix of young, athletic men and women and older, experienced hikers and woodsmen. Thompson, now grayer and a little slower, still commanded the room with his quiet presence. "We're going to teach you a lot of things in this course," he began, his voice a low rumble. "How to read a map, how to tie a knot, how to administer first aid. These are skills. They are important. But they're not the most important thing I can teach you." He paused, letting his gaze drift to the shadow box on the wall. "The most important thing is a lesson in humility. It's a lesson about assumptions. 2 years ago, on a day much like today, a child was lost in these same woods. We had all the gear, all the training, all the manpower, and we were failing. We were failing because the man in charge was listening to his own voice instead of observing the world around him. He was projecting his own biases onto the situation, and it made him blind." The recruits listened, rapt. They had all heard versions of the story, but to hear it from the sheriff himself was different. Then, a volunteer arrived. Thompson continued. "She didn't look like an expert. She wasn't wearing the right gear. She didn't talk like an expert. In fact, she barely talked at all. She was quiet. She was calm. And she was underestimated by everyone. Everyone except the one person who mattered. The lost little boy she found when no one else could." He walked over to the window, looking out at the familiar, forested hills. "We have a saying in this department now. Look for the quiet ones. The person who boasts about their skills is often the one most insecure about them. True professionals, the real Tier 1 operators in any field, whether it's in the military or medicine or right here in SAR, they don't have to tell you how good they are. They show you. Their competence is their credential. Their action is their resume." He turned back to the class, his eyes locking with each of the recruits in turn. "Your job is not to be the loudest. Your job is not to look the part. Your job is to be effective, to be professional, to put your ego in a box and focus on the mission. The person you're looking for doesn't care about your resume. They care about your results." He let the words settle, the weight of their meaning pressing down on the young volunteers. This was the legacy of Sergeant Cross. It wasn't a statue or a building named in her honor. It was this moment. It was a change in doctrine. It was a philosophy of service woven into the very DNA of the organization she had briefly touched. Her quiet competence had become the new standard, a silent creed passed from one generation of rescuers to the next. The true measure of a legacy is not what is remembered, but what is continued. The memory of Sergeant Evelyn Cross might fade over the decades, her name eventually becoming just a footnote on an old commendation plaque. But the standard she set that day would endure. It would live on in the quiet professionalism of a deputy who learned to listen, in the focused intensity of a young volunteer studying a well-worn manual, and in the institutional wisdom of a department that had learned the hard way to value substance over style. Her legacy wasn't a story, it was a behavior. It was the quiet confidence that comes from genuine skill, the humility that accompanies true expertise, and the unwavering focus on the mission that silences the distracting noise of ego. She had walked into a scene of chaos and, through the simple, powerful act of being competent, had restored order. She proved that respect is not a right of rank, but a dividend of action. She demonstrated that the most powerful voice in any room is often the one that says nothing at all, letting its work speak for it in clear, undeniable tones. Her actions became a silent promise, a benchmark for all who followed. The story of the jogger who saved the boy became more than just a local legend. It became a universal principle. It speaks to every person who has ever been judged on their appearance, every quiet professional who has been drowned out by the loud and arrogant, every individual who believes that what you do is infinitely more important than what you say. It is a testament to the idea that true authority is not claimed but recognized. It is the calm, steady hand in a crisis, the clear eye that sees the path forward, the quiet voice that says, "I will handle this," and then does. Sergeant Cross left behind more than a saved child and a humble deputy. She left behind a new way of thinking, a belief that the most effective weapon against ignorance is not argument, but demonstration. A conviction that the greatest strength lies not in broadcasting your power, but in the disciplined, silent application of it. The rain still falls on the Oregon woods, the Clackamas River still churns and flows, and people will still get lost. But now, those who go to find them carry with them the ghost of a quiet runner, a silent reminder that the person who looks the least capable might just be the one who can do the impossible. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud assumption, and where silent professionalism defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Stories.